Chapter 5, Jewish Fables by E. Michael Jones. The Gorging Gene. One of Harari's fictions, which involves the ability to transmit information about things which do not exist at all, is morality. Just as Darwinism tries to obscure the boundary separating animal communication from human speech, it also tries to come up with a materialistic explanation of morality by reducing it to a function of genetics. Like Professor Dawkins, who believes in a selfish gene, Harari believes that a widely accepted, gorging gene, rather than an inability to impose rational or moral control over appetite, is the cause of obesity. People are fat because the instinct to gorge on high-calorie food was hardwired into our genes. That's what makes some of us spoon down an entire tub of Ben & Jerry's when we find one in the freezer and wash it down with a jumbo Coke. Since the instinct to gorge on high-calorie food is hardwired into our genes, the next question should be, why isn't everybody fat? If we are all biologically programmed to gorge ourselves, why is it that some people eat moderately and some people do not? Why is it that some people are thin and fit and other people are morbidly obese? Does moderation, which is to say rational control over appetite, have something to do with this? According to Harari, moderation, or the virtue of temperance, qualifies unambiguously as a fiction, which is another word for unreal, whereas the gorging gene is just as unambiguously a scientific fact which is widely accepted. Not surprisingly, the same inability to subject appetite to rational control extends to human sexuality. Evolutionary psychologists, we are told, quote, argue that ancient foraging bands were not composed of nuclear families centered on monogamous couples. Rather, foragers lived in communes devoid of private property, monogamous relationships, and even fatherhood. In such a band, a woman could have sex and form intimate bonds with several men and women simultaneously, and all of the band's adults cooperated in parenting its children. Since no man knew definitively which of the children were his, men showed equal concern for all youngsters. Such a social structure is not an Aquarian utopia. It's well documented among animals, notably our closest relatives, the chimpanzees and bonobos." End quote. How do we know that the first humans were promiscuous? Well, because monkeys are. But humans are different from monkeys, aren't they? No, of course not. Just look at how ancient foraging bands behaved. This is proof that they behaved just like monkeys. The perceptive reader may have noticed a certain circularity in this argument. Neither the fossil record nor archaeology provides any evidence for Harari's theory of human sexuality. Why then does Professor Harari believe that it's true? Well, because it's well documented among animals. If animals are different from humans, however, the argument immediately collapses. Harari could, of course, point to the sexual mores of primitive peoples as indicative of how the first humans behaved. In fact, he seems to have consulted anthropologists like Margaret Mead at some point before making his claim that, quote, a good mother will make a point of having sex with several different men, especially when she is pregnant, so that her child will enjoy the qualities and paternal care not merely of the best hunter, but also of the best storyteller, the strongest warrior, and the most considerate lover. If this sounds silly, bear in mind that before the development of modern embryological studies, people had no solid evidence that babies are always sired by a single father rather than by many. End quote. Well, as a matter of fact, this does sound silly. For once, we find ourselves in complete agreement with Professor Harari. Depending on how he defines the term, modern embryological studies began either in 1827, when the germ layer theory of embryonic development, or the 1950s, with the discovery of the helical structure of DNA. If people living before either date were unaware that babies are always sired by a single father, how does Harari, the historian, explain things like primogeniture, not sure, inheritance laws, and the stigma of illegitimacy? Is Professor Harari familiar with the Hebrew term mamzer? M-A-M-Z-E-R? It appears in both Deuteronomy and the Talmud, which means that for somewhere between 2 and 3 millennia, Jews knew that a child was sired by one father, who was either married to the mother or not. If the child was sired outside of marriage, he was known as a mamzer, or a bastard, and certain legal consequences followed from what was clearly seen as a violation of the moral law. You would think that a professor at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem would know things like that. Preposterous claims that this lead the perceptive reader to wonder about the sources for the professor's theories. Do evolutionary psychologists have some mystical insight into the sex lives of the cavemen? Or is Professor Harari talking about something closer to home when he tells us that? Quote, the frequent infidelities that characterize modern marriages and the high rates of divorce, not to mention the cornucopia of psychological complexes from which both children and adults suffer, all result from forcing humans to live in nuclear families and monogamous relationships that are incompatible with our biological software, end quote. The best aid in understanding passages like this derives from Harari's theory of language. Our language, he tells us, evolved as a way of gossiping. This means that it wasn't enough for individual men and women to know the whereabouts of lions and bison. It's much more important for them to know who in their band hates whom, who is sleeping with whom, who is honest, and who is a cheat. Confirming the thought that immediately popped into my mind, Professor Harari writes, quote, the gossip theory might sound like a joke, but numerous, albeit uncited, studies support it. Even today, the vast majority of human communication, whether in the form of emails, phone calls, or newspaper columns, is gossip. It comes so naturally to us that it seems as if our language evolved for this very purpose. Do you think that history professors chat about the reasons for World War I when they meet for lunch, or that nuclear physicists spend their coffee breaks at scientific conferences talking about quarks? Sometimes, but more often they gossip about the professor who caught her husband cheating, end quote. So making use of the hermeneutic which Professor Harari himself provides, we are forced to conclude that when he purports to talk about the sexual mores of cavemen, Harari is in reality talking about the sexual behavior of the history faculty at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem and, dare we say it, about himself. Our suspicions are confirmed by Harari's Wikipedia entry, which announces that he is openly gay. Amazing. That concludes Chapter 5 of Jewish Fables by E. Michael Jones.